your presentation. I assume that was the famous Sermon on the Mount which he preached. I don't know if you've caught up with it. How are we going on those wooden pews? Are we comfortable? Anyone feeling a bit wriggly? Because there's kids' activities out there. But settle yourself in again. We're going to look at 1 Samuel. But let's start somewhere different from 1 Samuel, just briefly. I've never watched a Miss Beauty pageant before. Well, it's not the entire thing. But I have seen footage of one of the most awkward Miss Universe moments that I'm sure has ever... Some of you just smiled, which just told me at least you saw that bit, and some of you are secret Miss Universe beauty pageant watchers. But it was 2015 when this awkward moment happened at a Miss Universe beauty pageant. It was the climax of the whole event, and the host, Steve Harvey, was announcing the winner. And he got up and he announced the winner as Miss Columbia. Now the crown was put on her head, and there were smiles, and there were tears, and there was wandering around the stage, hugging, and all of that, only to be interrupted a few minutes later by Steve Harvey himself saying he got it wrong. He'd announced the wrong winner. The winner was actually Miss Philippines, not Miss Columbia. They crowned the wrong woman. Now, I will say that the two women were quite gracious in the way they handled it, but this big media affair, my goodness, it was awkward as they navigated their way through that. I noticed Steve Harvey, after admitting wrongdoing, bolted out the side very quickly. You don't see much of him afterwards. It pays to put the crown on the right head. Which brings us back to Samuel. Last week we met Samuel as a young lad, been called by God, much to Eli's confusion. And today we're going to jump forward only 5 chapters in 1 Samuel, but we find ourselves now with Samuel as an old man. Now, just in case you're upset about missing out, in the brief summary of the intervening chapters, it goes something like this. The Philistines defeated Israel. The Philistines steal the Ark of the Covenant. God makes life hard for the Philistines, so they return the Ark of the Covenant. Samuel leads the Israelites to victory over the Philistines, and then chapter 7 culminates with this statement. Samuel continued as Israel's leader all the days of his life. From year to year he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, judging Israel in all those places. But he always went back to Ramah, where his home was, and there he also held court for Israel, and he built an altar there to the Lord. So that was chapter 7's finish. Which brings us to chapter 8, our focus for this morning. And you heard chapter 8 read from verse 4, but I left out a little bit of a teaser at the start about why is the Israelite people suddenly demanding that Samuel gives them a king. Let me read to you the opening verses of chapter 8, which gives us a bit more of an idea of what's going on. It starts, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. And then what follows is the reading that you heard. Israel refuses to follow Samuel's sons and demands instead that he appoints a king like the other nations. Now, I don't know if it's just me, but when I read the Old Testament, I tend to think of Israel in a very simple, unified way. I kind of just treat them as one big entity. And so when I read things like the Israelites did good in the eyes of the Lord, or the Israelites displeased God, I kind of lump the whole nation together as one entity. And I found it interesting to read a bit about the dynamics that might have led Israel to demand a king, and think about it from a kind of political history perspective. So I want to start with some political history, which will lead us into something a little bit more theological. So from a political perspective, it's not entirely clear why the ancient Israelites transitioned from a tribal society into a monarchy in the early Iron Age. Up until this point, the most significant transition of leaders that we're aware of in the biblical text occurs when Moses dies and Joshua, Moses' assistant, takes over. And after that, the biblical text describes a fairly haphazard state of affairs in which charismatic leaders, known as judges, rose up from time to time to lead groups of Israelites, generally in battle, culminating in this figure of Samuel. And so, as the author of Judges records, in those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. It's not that monarchy was a new institution in the ancient Near East. It had deep roots in Mesopotamia and Egypt, as well as other nations surrounding Israel. So, historically, Israel was perhaps unusual in not having instituted a monarchy. Now, in the back of your minds, you might think, well, that makes sense, because we remember that Israel was called to be different from or set apart from their neighbours. So, we might have reasons for that. When King Saul rose to power, and this is where we're beginning to see this story, when King Saul rose to power, it was in a period characterised by unprecedented upheaval among Israel's neighbours. Throughout most of its recorded history, notes historian James Kugel, the little strip of territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea had been dominated by its larger, more powerful neighbours. Egypt to the south, Babylon and Assyria to the east, Aram and Syria to the north, and still further north, the Hittites. But during the reigns of Saul and David, most of those nations were distracted by their own internal issues. And it's possible that this reprieve gave the tribes of Israel a unique opportunity not only to cast off foreign domination, but to form a mini-empire of their own. In addition to the opportunities created by this temporary power vacuum, ancient Israel itself was likely experiencing inner turmoil due to competing coalitions within the tribes. And we see a hint of this at the start of 1 Samuel chapter 8, when the narrative is framed with that Samuel has grown old, he's appointed his sons as judges, yet his sons did not follow in his ways. They turned aside for gain, they took bribes, and they perverted justice. Things were not running smoothly within the tribes. So the people, the elders of Israel, say to Samuel, "We won't follow your sons, give us a king." I suppose for some of them then, a monarchy might have meant a more reliable system of government and more equitable rule than seemed likely under Samuel's sons. And for others, this is less obvious in the text, maybe those elders represented an elite segment of society who would also stand to benefit from a monarchy, the 1%, if you will. For them, having a king would create the possibility for significant personal gain, a society in which both power and resources were consolidated into the hands of a few. Now, the text doesn't provide any further clues as to who precisely was interested in a king, or even why, suggesting that it was the elders of the people of Israel, the people of Israel, or simply the people in some stages. But we do get their rationale, and that's the key bit. The stated rationale for such a dramatic social change is this: they wanted someone to govern them, they wanted to be like the other nations, and they wanted a king to go before them to fight their battles. And it's in these rationales that we discover the problem with Israel's demand. So the first problem is that they already had a king. Not a human king, but a God king. They wanted a king to lead them into battle, but God had already promised to be that leader. Here's the promise as outlined in Deuteronomy. In chapter 17, "You may say to yourselves, these nations are stronger than we are. How can we drive them out? But do not be afraid of them. Remember well what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt. You saw with your own eyes the great trials, the signs and wonders, the mighty hand and outstretched arm with which the Lord your God brought you out. The Lord your God will do the same to all the people you now fear." Israel already had a king to lead them into battle. Which leads us to the second problem. They wanted a king because they wanted to be like the other nations, and they want a king like the king of the other nations. They say, "Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." We want one of those kings. But God didn't want the people to have a king who would act like the other kings of the nations. The king of Israel was to act on behalf of God and completely trust in God. God had called Israel to be high above the nations, not like them. God wanted Israel to stand out and be different. But Israel didn't want to be different. They didn't want to stand out. Perhaps it's not that different for us today as a church and as Christians. Now, Samuel, understandably I suppose, was highly offended by this request. We won't follow your sons, give us a king. So he storms off to complain to God. Well, the text just says, this displeased Samuel, so he prayed to the Lord. I'm pretty sure there was some storming off. I'm sure he stormed off. And he prayed to the Lord. And God was equally displeased, although, as an aside, sort of tells Samuel off and says, it's not all about you, mate. This is about me. And he says to Samuel, okay, give the people what they want, but make it clear what it's going to cost them. So Samuel goes back and he warns them. He says, this king you want, this king will demand much of you. And take note of the warnings that he gives, because we're going to come back to it a little bit. He says, because anything you crown will demand something of you. Let's have a look at some of the demands the king will make. He says he will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. Verse 15. 1/10 is a tithe, the amount prescribed by the Torah to be given to the Lord. Now, Samuel's not suggesting that this king will divert the Lord's tithe to the king's purposes. He's saying the king will exact a tithe for his purposes over and above the tithe required by the Lord. It's kind of like, I saw recently, some of you may have seen, comedian Jimmy Reese does little video things, and there's one on tax, and he's complaining about tax. It's quite funny, especially if you're feeling a bit cynical about paying your tax. It's kind of like this. Israel, says Samuel, if you want a king, there will be income tax. There will be a 10% GST, that's 10% grain and sheep tax. And there will be family tax benefit. That is, the king will take part of your family for his benefit. Part A, he'll take your sons, and part B, he'll take your daughters. So it's not going to go well for them. But can you see what's happening here? Even though the king is not likely to rob from God, there's something disquieting about the prospect of a king setting himself up as God's equal, deserving of the same tithe. Anything you crown will demand something of you. So Samuel spells out in detail everything that this king will demand of them, but still, the people of Israel, or the people making the demands at least, say, we want our king. Give us a king. Now, I don't know if you've ever had one of those moments, perhaps as a parent, perhaps as a teacher or a leader of a group, where you've explained as clearly as you possibly could why the course of action they're proposing is a bad one. But they still want to go ahead with it. Perhaps you've heard yourself saying, no, Sam, I do not think putting Vegemite on your pasta is a good idea. No, Stevie, I do not think stacking all of those things on the edge of the table is a great idea. No, Alex, I don't think making that joke as part of your speech is a good idea. But it doesn't matter what you say. They're determined to go ahead with it. And so what do we say? Go on then. But don't come crying back to me when it goes wrong. And that's basically what Samuel says to the people. He says, when that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you've chosen. The Lord will not answer you that day. Don't come crying back to me when your king upsets you. So despite all the warnings, the people of Israel continue to demand a king, and God says, let them have their king. If we jump forward a few chapters, there's a bit of toing and froing, and we read in 1 Samuel chapter 11, Samuel says to the people, come, let us go to Gilgal, renew the kingdom there. And all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before Yahweh in Gilgal. There they offered sacrifices and peace offerings before Yahweh, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. Now we'll discover over the next few weeks just how Saul and those that followed him panned out as kings. But what does this episode in Israelite political history teach us? What lessons can we draw from it? Anything you crown will demand something of you. Bob Dylan highlighted the truth when he sang the song, Gotta Serve Somebody. I won't try and sing it to you because I can't do Bob Dylan justice, but the song starts like this. You may be familiar with it. You may be an ambassador to England or France. You may like to gamble, you may like to dance. You may be the heavyweight champion of the world. You may be a socialite with a long string of pearls. But you're going to have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed, you're going to have to serve somebody. And it's true, right? You're going to have a king in your life. We're all going to have a king in our life. You're going to place the crown on somebody or something. For some people, it'll be wealth, financially, or status, socially. For some people, it's going to be acceptance by a certain group or a certain person. For some of us, it's going to be appearance-based. For some of us, it's going to be achievement-based. A certain type of achievement, academic achievement, career achievement. Whatever the thing is that you bow to, and you come when it calls, that's your king. And anything you crown will demand something of you. And sometimes the thing you call on to save you will end up enslaving you. So when we talk about kings, don't think about prime ministers and presidents and world leaders and the monarchy. Don't think about it like that. Think about what you've crowned in your own heart as king. How often do we make the same mistake as Israel and crown the wrong king? Now, when Steve Harvey crowned the wrong Miss Universe, it was awkward. When we crown the wrong king in our lives, it can be devastating. You crown the wrong king and you eventually cry out for relief from the very king you've chosen. You become a slave to its master. Anything you crown will demand something of you. And that's the hard lesson the Israelites learned. It's a lesson that we can keep learning. But let me finish with a word of hope. Cast our minds forward a little briefly. Because God had a king in mind for Israel who would not be like the kings of the other nations. The problem was that it was not that Israel wanted a king, it was that they crowned the wrong king. God had a king for Israel. The king God crowns wore a crown of thorns. The king God crowned ruled through sacrifice and not gain. The king God crowned ruled in humility, not power. Jesus was the king the Israelites didn't know they needed. Jesus is the king that we need. So if you're having a Steve Harvey moment in life, if you've crowned the wrong king in your life, perhaps it's time to stage a coup. Perhaps it's time to change kings. Anything you crown will demand something of you. This is what Jesus demands in his own words. All things have been handed over to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal. Come to me then, all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. You will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Anything you crown will demand something of you. So be careful who or what you crown. As we sang at the beginning of our service, worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King